series. As a reminder, please turn off or silence your cell phones and other electronics before we get started. Double check this thing. Good. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. And please keep in mind that this reading series wouldn't be possible without generous support from people like you. Thanks to those of you who have donated already, and to those who haven't, please consider speaking either to me or to Dr. Sandra Meek about making a donation to help keep the reading series going in the future. I invited Matthew Griffin, Matt as he's known to me, as this year's reader because I'm biased. Matt and I attended school together at the University of Iowa, but that's not the reason for my bias. Rather, I wanted him to come to Barry because I'm familiar with his work. During our time in our master's program together, I had the opportunity to encounter a range of his characters that spanned from those who were obsessed with serial killers to the ghost of Judy Garland. He wrote fiction on a wild variety of subjects, and he always did so with such linguistic dexterity and precision that I was often jealous of his talent. So many of us in grad school were in our mid-20s or 30s, and here was this guy right out of college, writing some of the most exciting fiction I'd ever encountered. His first novel, Hyde, demonstrates his proclivity for bold writing. It's a shame that some might think of a novel about a same-sex marriage as bold, even today. But while to many readers it may still seem that way, it's not the moving relationship between Wendell and Frank in Hyde that really makes this a Matthew Griffin book. To me, as someone who's read other work of his, what makes this a Matthew Griffin book is its bold embrace of taxidermy. Like Wendell, when faced with the body of a deceased animal, this narrative is unflinching. Wendell and Frank even experienced their first physically romantic encounter between the skin and underlying flesh of a dead buck. Later in the book, when an animal dear to both Wendell and Frank dies, Wendell's response is to love that animal even in death by mounting it for posterity, just as any taxidermist might do, and he does so with great affection. Like Wendell's relationship to his work, and like his relationship to Frank, Hyde is an act of love, and that love shines through in every single beautiful line. Matthew Griffin is a graduate of Wake Forest University in the Iowa Writers Workshop. He's taught composition, literature, and creative writing at the University of Iowa, the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, and Walters State Community College. And he worked for several years as assistant to the director of Highlander Research and Education Center, a renowned hub of grassroots organizing for social justice throughout the South and Appalachia. He was born and raised in North Carolina and now lives with his husband and too many pets in New Orleans, Louisiana, where he teaches at Tulane University. Please help me welcome Matthew Griffin.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much to Dr. Donnelly for that very, very lovely introduction. And thank you to Dr. Donnelly and Dr. Meek for having me out here. It's been really just an absolute pleasure all day long. So thank you also to all of the wonderful, brilliant students that I got to talk with today. It was really, really fun. And also thank you for coming out on a Thursday night right before fall break. I know that some of you might be dreaming about the beach right now, although hopefully not Florida. But let's go to the northern beaches. Yeah, so thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. So the novel Hyde it's sort of structured following two narrative timelines. One of them starts in 1946 when Wendell Wilson, who is our narrator, and also, as Dr. Donnelly mentioned, a taxidermist, meets Frank Clifton, who has come home from World War II, and the two of them meet, fall in love, and then give up essentially everything else in their lives to be together in utter seclusion. And then the other narrative thread follows the end of their lives together as after Frank has a stroke and starts to suffer from dementia. So I'm just going to start with Wendell and Frank's first meeting, which is actually the second chapter of the book. And so I don't think this, because it's their first meeting, it doesn't need a ton of introduction other than just that the year's 1946 and Wendell is a taxidermist. I was wiping the blood off my hands when I saw him. I was 23 years old, and outside the whole town, buildings and trees, and the first green buds of tentative spring was coated in a casing of ice from a late winter storm, like something in a museum, something fragile and important that had to be preserved, kept from all the grubby hands that would want to touch it. The power lines sagged beneath the weight, and the trees and streets and sidewalks held themselves tense, waiting for the snap. But in those last minutes of afternoon, as the trees darkened and flattened into silhouettes against the sky, the ice began to loosen, gathering slow into cold drops that hung so heavy and still, it seemed they would never fall. I was on my way to the window to flip my notice from open to closed. Though of course nobody had set foot in the shop in the 3 days since the storm hit, and I had been reduced to skinning squirrels out of sheer boredom. Dragging a rag across my fingers so they wouldn't stain the sign, and there he was, standing on the train tracks that ran down the middle of the street to the depot on the corner, wearing an old coat a few sizes too small, the cuffs of which didn't even come down to his big, knobby wrists. He was about the tallest fellow I'd ever seen, with wide shoulders squeezed up and together by his jacket. He didn't have any gloves on or a hat, and his cheeks were red and raw, his hair yellow, thin, and straight, all except for one curled forelock that rested on his brow like something wilted. You could tell he hadn't been home long from the war. He stood stiff upright, as if constantly startled by the world around him. And he had that look, as he turned to survey its thawing landscape, of trying to find anything that seemed familiar. It was getting dark, but the sky above the buildings was bright pink with light reflected off the snow. He lifted his hands to his lips, clasped them together, and breathed onto his fingers before shoving them as far as he could into the pockets of his coat. The glow of the street lamps filtered cold through the window, twice distilled by ice and glass. I opened the door, and the noise was so loud I couldn't even walk into it. All around was the thud of snow clumps falling into snow piles, the groan of ice as it spread beyond itself, the crackle as it split apart. "Excuse me," I yelled. "Were you looking for something?" He turned, startled. "No," he said. "Nothing in particular." "Oh." I shoved the rag, stiff with dried blood, into my back pocket. "I thought you might be lost." He shook his head and took a few steps toward me, ducking under the branch of an elm. The thin layer of ice atop the snow broke under his boot sole, and its jagged edges caught on his khaki pants, tugging them up from his ankle. He squinted at the hawk mounted on an ossified branch in the window, at the snake curled about the bough. They stared back, impassive. The collar of his coat was half bit away and unraveling, and the seams were pulled so tight over his shoulders you could see each stitch that barely cobbled them together as he held out his hand. It was enormous, with big, wide fingers, and knuckles the size of walnuts. "Frank Clifton," he said. Water dripped from an icicle, lashed the pile of shoveled snow at his feet. "Wendell Wilson." I shook his hand harder than I needed to, and wished I didn't have black crusts cupped in my cuticles. His sleeve drifted further up his forearm, where a dark scrawl on the skin barely slipped out from beneath the cuff. "Pleased to meet you," he said, smiling wide and earnest, and I thought I'd be struck down by it, the way it struck down mortals to behold Zeus in his full, blazing divinity, reduced them to ash, the painful glory of him. The branches shuttered off their casks of ice, and the power lines broke free of their insulation, snapped taut and scattered it over the street in pieces that still cupped the hollow channel where the wire had run. Icicles plunged from gutters and shattered on the sidewalk. Sheets of snow slid from roofs. The din of it, the creak and thump and shatter, sounded like the world coming undone. How's the sound? Is it good? Not too loud? All right, good. I've been working on the thing when I read where you look up at the audience. I'm naturally really, really bad at it. But then I went to this reading and a poet read before me, and she was so good at looking up and like making eye contact with people in the audience. And so I'm trying to get better at doing that without completely forgetting where I am in the text. So I'm going to actually skip forward in time now, but backwards in the book, and read a little bit from the very beginning. And so this also doesn't, I think, require a lot of background information, since this is really exactly where the novel starts out. And this is happening in about 2005. Lord knows how long he's been lying out there, flat on his back in the middle of the vegetable garden. I see him through the smudged window over the kitchen sink as I'm carrying the groceries to the counter, the day burning bright all over him. I wasn't gone but an hour. I set down my bags and hurry out the back door. I've got 2 more waiting in the car. "Frank," I yell, "are you all right?" He doesn't say a word, not until I'm looming right over him, my shadow draped across his chest and following the wrinkles in his plaid shirt before falling flat onto the dirt. He looks up at me, not even squinting against the sun. 3 or 4 of his tomato plants are crushed underneath him, their silver-furred vines curled about his arms and knees, like something that wants to pull him into the earth. He's broken a stake at trying to haul himself up, and ripped 2 more from the ground, torn cuts in it, clotting with dark soil. "I'm fine," he says. "Just needed to lie down for a second." "In the middle of your tomato plants?" "Just wore out from the sun," he says. His speech is sloppy and slurred as a drunk's. "Smile for me," I say. One corner of his mouth twitches upward, while the other stays still, pulls his face into a lopsided grin. "Can you raise your arms?" He lifts them both, but one drifts right back down just as soon as it's risen, pulled back to the dirt by an insistent, invisible hand. I squeeze the one reaching for me. The green smell of tomato leaves is on his fingers. "Don't you move," I say, and I get myself back in the kitchen quick as I can and call for the ambulance. The operator doesn't sound like she's in too big of a hurry, and I'm fairly sure she's eating donuts. Makes all her words sound fat. I pace the tile thin, waiting for her to take down Frank's name and our address. "And be quick about it," I say. "It's an emergency." "That's what they all say, sir." The phone's mounted on the wall. I leave it off the hook, swinging by its cord over the floor, in case they need to trace the call in order to locate us. I wouldn't be one bit surprised to find out she'd written our address down wrong. And take Frank out a glass of water. I hold it to his lips, but then, if only half of him is still working, he might not be able to swallow it right and choke to death before they get here to rescue him. And he's so heavy, I don't believe I can even roll him over myself. I yank the glass from his lips before he can take a gulp, but he doesn't seem to care, just looks at me with that same muddled expression. His old blue baseball cap's tilted backwards, nearly fallen off his head. He keeps that thing perched so high and loose, any breeze might knock it away, and usually does. He spends half his time out here picking that cap up from wherever the wind's taken and dropped it. But he hates anything to squeeze his skull. "Well," he says, as if we've lingered here just a little too long after the conversation's run its course, and things have become awkward. "Does anything hurt?" I say. He raises the one eyebrow he can. His cap rustles up with it. "Half of me feels mighty strange," he says, "like it ain't hardly there." I snatch the cap off his head. Sweat stains along the band have turned the inside pale green in a few splotches. I stand here in the bright heat and fan him with it, stirring the thick air into the measliest of slow-moving breezes, barely trembling the white wisps of his hair, for what seems like 2 hours of waiting while he stares up at me with a blank, lopsided grin. Gives me the creeps. "Stop smiling like that," I say. "It gives me the creeps." The raised half of his mouth slowly slips down his cheek, toward his chin. "It's too hot out here. You shouldn't have been working out here in the first place." He's 83 years old, for heaven's sake. An 83-year-old doesn't have any business being outside in the middle of the day like this. I'm sure there's some kind of heat advisory in effect, warning people to get their pets and their elderly inside, safe in the air conditioning. And of course, he's only got the sleeves of his shirt rolled halfway up his forearms, never an inch higher, even in the full heat of summer. Sweat trickles down my back. I hate to sweat. Finally, the siren wails down the road, and the ambulance tires grumble on the long gravel drive through the trees and up to the house. Sun's blazing so bad I can't even see the swirling red lights. They skate invisible over the leaves, over the house's white vinyl siding. I open the wooden gate to the backyard and lead the paramedics to him. Panic splashes across his face, running under his limp features as they kneel over him. "I feel fine," he says, "just wore out from the sun," before they can even press the stethoscope to his chest and ask him what symptoms he's suffering. "You can go on," he says. It takes the both of them a good couple minutes of heaving and hauling to peel him off the ground and lift him onto a stretcher. The earliest tomatoes are splattered like gunshot wounds all across his back. I pour the glass of water over the crushed vines and into the dirt. The dark stain of it sinks down and disappears. "You coming along?" one of the paramedics grunts as they lift the stretcher into the ambulance. I'm not too keen on the looks of them. They've both got thick, scuzzy mustaches over their wet mouths. And I don't like close quarters like that anyway. Everybody breathing their germs all over each other. And who knows what they've picked up from the seeping wounds and phlegm of this town sick and injured. Frank stares at me, wide-eyed and worried as his face permits, as they fit the oxygen mask over his nose and mouth. "Hold on just a second," I say. My car door is still wide open, the alarm bell dinging, and 2 plastic bags slumped in the back seat, waiting to be carried inside. I close the door and hurry back and let one of the paramedics help me up the ramp. Frank and I are careful not to look at each other too much. They close us up and speed down the drive, tires hissing ruts in the gravel, the siren stretching behind us, still wailing in the yard long after we've turned onto the road and the trees have blotted it from sight. So I'm just going to skip forward a little bit here. We're still in the same chapter. When they get to the hospital, Wendell pretends to be Frank's brother, which is something that he's sort of grown accustomed to doing on the rare occasions that they go in public to sort of diffuse any questions someone might have about them. And so, right, he finds out at the hospital that Frank has had a stroke and then spends the night there. And this is when he wakes up the next morning, and Frank has been unconscious this entire time. I wake up in my cot beside his bed at 8 in the morning. My neck hurts, and everything around me looks bright and slow-moving, like it's happening through a sunny haze. Frank hasn't changed positions, hasn't even moved his arm. A new nurse comes in to check on him. This one's red-faced and in a rush. "He hasn't moved," I say. "He's resting," she says. "Is he in a coma?" "No," she says. "He's definitely not in a coma." "Then why hasn't he moved?" "He's resting." "I think he's in a coma. You need to have somebody come in and evaluate him. Shine that little flashlight on his eyeballs." She jabs a syringe into his IV tube. I lean real close so I can make sure she doesn't pump any air bubbles in. On the other side of the pink curtain, a man groans. "That man needs your assistance," I say. But she starts fiddling with the plastic clothespin they've got clipped on Frank's middle finger. It sounds like it's very bad. I turn on the TV, bolted high on the cinder block wall, and looking every moment like it's on the verge of crashing down on us to drown him out. And finally she stomps her way around the curtain. In the morning news, they're looking for an 8-month-old boy that's gone missing up in Virginia, just a couple hours north of here. His mother set him down in his bouncy seat while she went to run the water for his bath, and when she came back, he was gone. They keep showing the headline, "Have you seen little Larry?" in black on a band of yellow, like the caution tape police use to cordon off brutal crime scenes. Underneath the picture of him wrapped up in a powder blue blanket and looking like every other baby in the entire world. The bouncy seat, the newsman says, was still quivering with his last bounce. A hand lands heavy on my arm. I turn in my seat, and Frank's eyes are open, bleary but conscious, looking all about him. "Where are we?" he says, real slow. "The hospital," I say. "No," he says, "that don't sound right." "Look around. Where do you think?" "How long have I been here?" "Since yesterday afternoon." "Did you water the garden?" he says. "Of course," I lie. "Good. Don't let the weeds get a hold of it." He pats my hand weakly and smiles, one corner of his mouth moving quickly, the other slowly catching up. He heaves a heavy breath and dozes off again. I pull my hand from his. "Nurse," I yell, "nurse." And there's a brief space break here. 2 days he's been here, and he's already getting antsy. They've taken him to run a bunch more tests, gotten him a private room, and barely have him propped up in the bed with his lunch tray pushed against his chest before he's asking me, "When can I go home?" "You can't even get your own self out of the bed," I say. "I feel fine." "That's what you said the other day, too, while all the blood was seeping out of your brain." "Be sweet to me," he says, frowning. He's still slurring his words a little. They sound swollen. It's only the drugs that haven't loosened up enough to talk to me in public like this. After his heart surgery, you'd have thought I was some monster come to terrorize him, the way his eyes roved to rest on every single surface in the room but me. "There's too many old people here," he says, peering suspiciously down the hall. "They kept wheeling them past my door all night long." "How would you know?" I say. "You were passed out on drugs the whole time." "The squeak of the wheels gets into your dreams," he says. His hands tremble on the white sheets, shake for the sheer terror of uselessness, and his jaw keeps chewing invisible cud. He doesn't seem to notice. "The doctor's supposed to come by in a little bit," I say. "You need to eat your lunch." I can't even tell what my lunch is. Each compartment on his plastic tray is filled with a different color of mush. "Ain't they already feeding me through one of these?" He paused the bundle of IV tubes. The nurse fastened them with a few straps of Velcro just to get them out of his way. "It's just sugar water," I say. "Eat. You need to get your strength up. The sooner you do, the sooner we can go home. My rear end's permanently sore from sitting in these chairs all day." He looks put out, but he reaches for his spoon. His fingers shake so bad they have trouble closing around it. And that's the hand that still works right. The other one he can't even ball up in a fist yet. "What are you scared of?" I say. "The applesauce?" He frowns at his fingers as if he could whip them into stillness with just a stern look, and closes them, real deliberate and tight, around the spoon's handle. And he does get them under control, but it looks like he squeezed their trimmers up into his wrist and rocks his whole hand back and forth so hard it dumps half a spoonful into his lap before he can get it to his mouth. I may have to request him a bib before it's all over. I've got the TV on the court channel where little Larry's mother is holding a press conference to unveil the police sketches of the strange man she kept seeing in the days before her baby disappeared, pretending to trim a bush in her apartment building's parking lot, leaning against the side of the soda machine at the laundromat, crouching in the third-story window of the abandoned cigarette factory across the street from her bedroom. "Ooh," Frank says. He pushes himself up in the bed to get a better look. He loves murders and kidnappings and things like that. The suspect's perfectly clean-shaven, and his hair is black and oiled and combed neatly back from his pale forehead and dark eyes, with a level straight part along one side, the way I used to keep mine. "She's the one who did it," Frank says. "You think? Look how much makeup she's got on. It's caked all over her face, so thick you can see the line along her jaw where it stops. And the skin above that line is a whole different color from the skin below. She's got her blonde hair done up in ringlets, sprayed stiff into place like she's going to a fancy party, and a tight blouse with the top 3 buttons undone, so it's only by pure chance we can't all see her brassiere. Mascara runs down her cheeks in cloudy black tears, cutting through big swaths of rouge. If that's not the face of guilt itself," he says, "I don't know what is." "Please," she says, "if anyone watching has seen this man, call the police. And if this man is watching, please bring my baby back. I'm begging you. Bring little Larry home, please. I'll give you anything. Anything. All I want is my little boy. That's all." Her face twists into sobs. She has to hold the podium to keep herself standing. "Look how hard she's crying," I say. "You mean to tell me you believe that?" "I sure do. Nobody that concerned about how she looks would come on national television and cry that ugly if she didn't have a good reason." He sighs. "You never were very good at this sort of thing," he says. The sheriff puts his arm around her shoulders and leads her into a crowd of deputies. They shield her from the cameras. "I don't think she did it," I say. It's always the mother that did it, he says. Who else but a mother would want to commit a crime against a baby? Nobody else cares enough about babies to commit crimes against them. They'll have her in jail by the end of the week. You want to bet? What do you have to bet that I would want, he says. Not a thing. Another 2 bites of applesauce, and he's asleep again. I never know what to say when I stop to drink water, because I feel like I need to fill the space, and everyone tells me that I can just stop and drink the water. Cool, so I'm going to skip back in time once more, as the book tends to do. And so a little further along in the book, it's the 8th chapter. And so this is happening again in 1946. It's a couple months later than the chapter I read earlier. And so in the intervening time, after much hesitation and awkwardness, Frank and Wendell have actually begun a romantic relationship. And so this chapter is sort of the only time they ever go on a trip or a vacation together. And then a couple things to know in this chapter is that in a previous chapter, Frank has told Wendell about landing on Omaha Beach on D-Day. And he's also shown Wendell a series of tattoos that he got when he was in the Army. Both of those. And in the story of him landing at Omaha Beach, he talks about the way that almost all of the soldiers he was there with drowned on the way into the beach because their packs full up with water, pulled them down. And so that comes up a little bit later in this chapter as well. We went to the beach together at the end of that first summer. Stayed in a little 2-room shack with plywood walls, so flimsy the sea breeze would have knocked them down on top of us if there weren't so many gaps between the boards for it to slip through instead of strain against. We slept for the first time in the same bed. So narrow, he crushed me against the wall and had to peel his chest from my sweaty back just to roll over. But I rested better than I had in years. I loved how deeply he breathed in the night, how early and suddenly he rose in the morning, as though sleep were a thin covering you could throw back as easily as the sheets. I loved how he had to stoop every time he walked through a door. He cooked breakfast, humming as he pushed scrambled eggs around a dented skillet on the hot plate and waited for the last gleaming bits of moisture to burn away, while I summoned the will to get up. Even at my happiest, it always took me a long time lying in the bed, half awake, to convince myself the world was worth waking into. He had the loveliest voice, though. Could have been a singer if he'd wanted. Every note sounded like a deep laugh. I didn't know you could cook, I said, when the pop and sizzle and smell of bacon frying finally pulled me shuffling to the worn wood bench at the dining table. It barely fit between the walls. We had to climb over it to get from one side to the other. This is it, he said. Bacon, eggs, and toast. Don't expect nothing else. He learned it in the Army. He was in his swim trunks already, in a white undershirt with yellow sweat stains creeping from the armpits. He scraped the eggs and bacon onto my plate and pressed 2 slices of bread into the greasy pan. Nothing I've ever cooked in all of these years has ever tasted as good. Afterwards, we walked through loose, hot sand that fell away from our feet and pulled us into lurching, uneven steps, down to where the waves solidified it into wet silt that held us up and held, for a few moments, the shape of our footprints. It was early still, maybe 10 o'clock, and the light was hazy and soft, broken on the waves and blurred with salt. The breeze blew the loose sand in tumbling swirls toward our legs, then away, knotting together and blowing apart. There wasn't hardly anyone else on the beach, just clumps of families so far away they could have been piles of driftwood or heaps of seaweed. They may have been. Realtors had only built the rickety bridge to the island a couple years earlier, and there was just the one ramshackle motel then, and some falling down shanties like ours, tucked into the dunes for solitary fishermen. We took each other's pictures with the camera I'd bought to photograph my mounts for a newspaper ad. In them, he's standing with his hands on his hips, like he's surveying the shore and not particularly pleased with what he sees. His brow jutted low to drape both his squinting eyes in shadow. the corrugated sea hammered out behind him. Just from the walk down to the water, he's already drenched in sweat, his shirt hanging in heavy folds, his hair stringy and flat with it. His bare legs are huge, his calves almost as thick as his thighs. He tugged his shirt over his head and grabbed my hand, pulled me toward the water. His palm felt rough and smooth at the same time, like sandpaper caked with the dust it's ground away from wood. And his cheeks and shoulders and chest were sunburnt bright pink now, with dead skin peeling away in thin, papery scraps. "You go on," I said, taking his shirt. "You can't swim?" "I can swim," I said. "I don't." "Come on," he said. "It's no fun by yourself." "I don't trust water I can't see my feet through." He looked mighty disappointed. I watched him wade out past the sandbar, where the waves crashed and foamed, until the ocean covered his shoulders, and its rolling surface sometimes obscured him completely from view before it sank again toward the earth. And there he spread his arms, lay on his back, and floated as though a lighter man had never been born. I could hardly believe somebody of his size could float so effortlessly, palms upturned to the sun, head leaned back as on a cushion, legs lounging just beneath the water, with their upturned toes breaking through it to point at the sky. I sat just beyond the water's reach and wriggled my fingers and toes into the wet, gleaming sand at the furthest edge of a just receded wave. I scooped up fistfuls of it, let it run between my fingers and over the edges of my hand. When I opened my fist and spread it wide, the sand cupped inside it broke open along the lines of my palm. Frank waved at me as if I was an old friend he hadn't seen in years, and couldn't believe his incredible fortune to come upon here, in this very place, his tattoos warping with the movements of his muscles like the shadow of a shifting cloud upon his skin. The waves built up and passed beneath him. Sometimes the water ran across and pooled in the hollow between his chest and stomach, but it never could push him under. And I understood then how he made it to shore while all those other boys drowned. And I waved back, the wet sand trickling down my forearm, hardening as it dried into grainy, translucent rivulets that cracked and fell away. A wave spread itself across the shore as thin as it could without disappearing, then gathered itself up as it slipped backwards beneath the next, which unfurled forward and over it, as though the two were actually separate bodies, instead of twin fibers of the same heaving muscle. I marveled at that, how a single thing could move both forwards and backwards, in two directions at once. You could do anything you wanted, I thought then, anything at all. He walked dripping out of the water. It poured off him in streams that ran back into the ocean, where they gave up their edges and shape and became again indistinguishable, as if they'd never pressed against him. Sea foam clung to his ribs and knees before dissolving in the wind. He sat heavily beside me in the sand and kissed me, his wet lips salty, the hair on his legs burning gold in the sun. Its light fell full and hard down on him, burned away another layer of his skin. I loved to touch those tender, sunburnt spots, how he tensed against the twinge of pain, how my white fingerprints on his chest filled back in with red. We're not together in any of the photographs. It was reckless enough just to walk out in the open in the sun like that without going and asking some stranger, who might not turn out to be one after all when you got close enough to take our picture. But we've still got all of them in a cedar box at the top of the closet, with his medals from the war and his mama's wedding rings. And as tenuously as they link us, they're the only real evidence that any of it ever happened, that we were ever even in the same vicinity. The rest we got rid of, if it ever existed at all. We never wrote each other love letters, anything someone might find. And he never came to my shop at the same time 2 days in a row, or by the same path through the downtown streets and alleys. Once I went to throw some carcasses in the trash can out back. The big noticeable ones I had to haul off myself, but the smaller ones, squirrels and possums and owls, I tossed in the trash can and nobody was the wiser. Only to find him crawling on hand and knee down the alley to stay below the line of sight of some poor tenement family eating their gruel in the window above. "So nobody can establish a pattern," he said, real gruff and clipped, looking up at me from the ground. He was the most worried about his mama. He was the only one she had left, after all. His older brother, Harvey, and his baby sister, Iris, had both died from consumption when he was a boy. It's strange now to think about how many and often people died when we were children. It was happening all the time. Everybody had brothers and sisters, more than one usually, who never saw their 10th birthday. So many people survive these days. Everybody lives so awfully long. She was always trying to send him courting some girl she'd just met, and talking about how empty that old house felt, and how she sure would like to have some grandchildren someday to fill it back up. She was supposedly not in the best of health, had dizzy spells and heart palpitations and the vapors, she called it. I was never convinced that was anything but a ploy to keep his attention. But I didn't blame him for protecting her, for protecting himself. He lost enough already, felt enough pain. I didn't want him to know how it felt to fumble for an excuse, to stammer and redden, and try to explain without explaining the compromised position in which he'd been found. I didn't want him to see the change in his mother's eyes as the stain of understanding spread through them, seeping back through every memory and forward into every hope, so that no matter which way she looked, every side of him was tinged with filth and soaked in sorrow. I'd never met her, never even seen her from afar, but I felt her pull on us all the time, every minute we were together, even lying there on the beach in the hot sun. It wasn't something we argued or even talked about, but a fundamental underlying force, like all forces invisible, that shaped our every surge toward each other and our every drifting apart, as if she was some enormous, distant mass, so far away you couldn't see it, but so heavy and dense, it warped all the space around it, curved it so sharp that by 7:30 every night, he started to look down at his feet and out the window at the darkening sky. And every straight line I tried to pull him along into the hot night, no matter how fast and sure, bent into an arc that carried him back to her in time for dinner at 8. And so the closest any of those pictures come to showing the two of us together is my blurred fingertip, creeping in at the edge of one of them, like the first dark sliver of the moon, invisible in the bright sky until just that moment, beginning to pass across the sun. Thank you. Yeah, so if people have questions, I am happy to answer questions and chat. That's usually my favorite part of these things. Yes?
So this was your first novel? So what have you written before this?
So, I wrote a few short stories when I was in college and graduate school, and then I actually spent 5 years before I started working on this book, working on another novel that I worked on for a long time before, after 5 years of work, coming to the devastating realization that it was a terrible book and that I hated it. And I shouldn't laugh into the microphone. And that it was a horrible failure. And so actually the experience of then going back through that book in sort of a desperate attempt to pull anything salvageable out of it was what led me to end up writing this book. There were just a few sentences and images in that manuscript that were essentially about my grandparents and my grandmother to the end of their lives, trying to take care of my grandfathers and feeling really frustrated by them. And so those few images really sort of came to life for me and got me thinking about what it would be like to spend your whole life, right, and like sacrifice and compromise for someone, only to have them, of course, in the end, ultimately pass away. And so from there I started thinking too about what it would have been like as a gay person in the 20th century to do the same thing, with sort of all that added dangers and sacrifices that would come with it. So that was a very long way of answering your question, right, which is that I really spent most of my time before this writing a book that then never worked. which I think is a common experience too. You know, I think a lot of writers have, you know, I think people, there's a piece of advice that you should write your first novel and then put it in a drawer somewhere and never let anybody see it. So I think a lot of people do that. Other questions? Oh, cool. Yes.
What inspired you, I guess, to start the story in well, not the present, but later, and then go back instead of doing the reverse?
Yeah, so really, the reason I did that was because the story of the two, particularly the story of Wendell trying to take care of Frank at the end of his life, was really sort of the initial impulse behind the book. Once I started looking at those, those pieces from the novel that failed, the thing that was most interesting to me was what is ultimately a really futile struggle. And it's a struggle in vain of Wendell trying to hold on to Frank when we know that inevitably Frank is slipping away and not going to get better. I'm sort of, in general, really interested in futility. I find it, I think, sort of beautiful. The idea of like doing something even though you know you're going to fail at it because it means the most to you. And so that was really the part of the novel that initially pulled me in. And then a lot of that material that takes place in the past sort of happened once I started writing. I became interested in wanting to see who these characters were as young men and wanting to explore their life together. And so that's why the book really starts out in the later years of their lives, was because that to me felt like really the most important exploration that the book could undertake, and that a lot of that other material about their lives together I thought worked best sort of supporting that bigger narrative. Yeah?
Could you talk a little bit about how your perception on writing and on literature in general shifted when you became a teacher after being a student?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, actually. I think sort of the switch to being a teacher from a student, I think I actually started to become more and more aware of just like how little actually I know about writing, particularly about writing. I think my approach to literature feels fairly the same for me. Although also I will say that when I was a student, I was the person in class who never spoke a word. And because I was just almost like really terrified and shy, and especially then like when I was in graduate school, as Dr. Donnelly noted, I went to graduate school right out of college, and so I was really young, and so I felt very intimidated by all these really brilliant, smart, great writers all around me. And so part of, I think, the switch between the two for me was just having to learn to talk and link to people. But I think also something that switched for me as I started to talk about before that aside was that the longer I've taught, the less I feel that I really know about writing. And I think that and part of this too is that I think results from the experience of having worked on that first novel under sort of like a set of assumptions about the fact that like if I sat down and put in the work and thought things through and really cared, that would be enough. And then realizing that actually it wasn't enough, and that there is some other element that I think you get to through work and discipline, but that also is this sort of like ineffable, ephemeral quality that makes everything come together. And so having sort of like worked in one really particular way and then switched over and worked and written in a really different way that was a lot less controlled and a lot less calculated, I think it really just underscored for me the fact that every person is going to end up writing in a completely different way. And that the most I can do for my students is tell them what I've learned, tell them what's worked for me, and tell them what seems to have worked for other people. But then also always say, like, you have to figure out what's going to work for you. because every writer works in a completely different way, and people have written really beautiful, brilliant books in ways that I could never do. And so I think that was the biggest switch for me, especially like from being a student and being in graduate school, knowing I wanted to be a writer. Right? I just thought if I listen to these people and their rules, I can write something good. And I think maybe it's true that you can write something good, but if you want to write something that you really love and that is aiming for greatness, I think there's a way that you have to sort of forget all those rules and think that everybody who's ever told you any rule about writing was either a liar or didn't know what they were talking about. Which is not to say that you shouldn't listen to your writing teachers, because you should. Right, but there's, I think, a certain point at which you have to sort of say that, like, as an artist, you're just going to do whatever you want. And that's, I think, been a difficult balance to reach as a teacher, right? To try to be useful and give students, right, like practical skills that they can use in their work, while also telling them not to believe anything that I say. So yeah, it's kind of a strange thing. Yeah.
Was struck looking at your book on Amazon, and you have 5 stars and you have 1 star. And I hate this book. This is the most beautiful book I've ever read. And the haters seem to be about the sadness of the book. So, and you're not supposed to read reviews.
So I actually am, which I don't think is healthy. I don't think it's a good thing, and I should really stop probably checking my Amazon page to see if there are new reviews. But I actually, so the fact that the distribution of reactions to the book is so extreme is something that actually makes me feel pretty good. Like I would rather have sort of an even split of 5 stars and 1 stars, which will say I think the 5 stars outweigh the 1 stars. On Amazon at least. I'm not trying to undersell this. Right, but like I think I would rather have sort of like really extreme reactions on both ends than to have everybody just sort of feel okay about it. You know, I'd rather have a bunch of 5 stars and a bunch of 1 stars than all 3 stars in some way, because I feel at least that then I've provoked an emotional reaction of some sort, even if it is, right, even if it is hatred. And yeah, a lot of people I think do find the book to be, right, kind of bleak and sad, and I understand that. There's actually, on Goodreads, I made the mistake early on of following some of the reviews that people were writing, and there's a really fantastic exchange between, so a woman read sort of an advanced copy of the book, and she really, really loved it, and she wrote this just incredibly, really sweet and wonderful, but also I think hyperbolic, glowing review in which she recommended it to every living person in all caps. Like there were a lot of all cap statements in this review. And so she recommended it to every living person. And then in specific, she recommended it to a friend of hers who was in some sort of book group with her. And so then the woman she recommended it to hated it and wrote a review just as long, which I didn't read in as much detail, but I did read, and that probably also used some all caps phrases to express how much she hated it. And then from there, the two of them got into this really, really intense fight in the comments section, which ended in the woman who hated the book deleting all the comments from the woman who loved the book, and then the woman who loved the book unfriended the woman who loved it. And now the relationship is destroyed. And so, like at that point, I feel like I've done my job. Yeah, so I mean, I think like extreme reactions either way, I'm kind of happy with. Yeah, maybe if they were all really reactions of extreme hatred, then certainly I would be sad. But there's enough people who seem to really like it that it outweighs the others. Yeah.
So like just with how blatantly morbid Wendell's is, have you ever considered making him be a serial killer?
So, I do myself have a mild obsession with serial killers. And so while I am really interested in serial killers, it never occurred to me to make that decision, because I think it would have created a profoundly different book. Right, I was really, I was really invested in their relationship, and I really care about these characters. And as strange as Wendell can be at times, part of that strangeness certainly is, I think, just a natural reclusiveness on his part. But the other aspect that really makes his strangeness more extreme is the fact that they've had to live in isolation for so long. And that, the effects of that isolation that they've undergone for their own safety heightens the things that are a little bit strange about him, and also gives him like a slightly skewed perception of the outside world. Because he hasn't had strong relationships with anyone outside of Frank. Most of what he understands of the world comes to them through television, which I think we all can probably agree gives us a somewhat absurd picture of the society that we live in. And so I think part of his strangeness comes from the fact that he approaches everyone in the world with a little bit of suspicion, starting from the beginning, because he doesn't want them to know about his relationship with Frank, and then later on, because everything he's seen about the world as it's vastly and sort of drastically changed in his lifetime, seems really foreign to him. And so I think that's actually a big part of what makes him sort of seem a little bit morbid and weird. Although also too, I'm just interested in some of those things, and so that all gets into the book. Yeah.
Let's talk about Beyonce.
We should always talk about Beyonce. Yes.
What's your favorite song from Lemonade, and why?
Okay. So my first initial response is I Ain't Sorry, because I think that's just a really great song, and I like its... But I think one of the really fun parts of Lemonade is seeing Beyonce really give it to Jay-Z, and just be honest about the fact that I'm the best, and you're lucky to be with me, I like the sass and the anger of I Ain't Sorry. But I'm also actually a big fan of Sandcastles, because it's sadder and sweeter, and in the end those are usually the things that get me. So I'm going to say it's a tie between those two. Any other questions? Beyonce or non-Beyonce? Either way. Well, cool. Thank you all so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
We've got copies of Hyde for sale in the back, and Matt Griffin will be happy to sign your own copy.
Absolutely.